Hi, I am Conor Friedersdorf, features editor at Culture 11.
And I'm Jay Rosen, author of PressThink and teacher of journalism at New York University.
And I am an alumni of New York University. I didn't take a class with you, Jay, but we did work together both before I was there and since I've been there. And I wanted to get your take first on the press and the 2008 election.
Wow, what an ordeal. I wrote back in January that I thought going into the 2008 election, the press had decided basically on a horse race model, and that the horse race press was now an institution, that it had been critiqued but it wasn't going away. And so I kind of looked at it in a different way than I had before. Instead of seeing horse race journalism as the problem, I began to look at it as the solution. And it's the solution to how do you immerse yourself, Conor, deeply in politics and care enough to report on this campaign for 2 years, be away from your home, away from your family, on the road with these manipulative people. Why would you do that? Well, it can only be because you really care about politics. So how do you immerse people into politics as journalists, make them care, and yet prevent them from forming attachments, right, to candidates and causes and normal politics? How do you immerse and detach? Well, it seemed to me that the best answer that the press had ever come up with was horse race journalism. And it worked for the owners, it works for the journalists. It's reusable, it's teachable, anybody can do it. You can just take it out every 4 years like the Christmas tree and plug it in.
I think one thing that our magazine launched midway through the primary season.
That's Culture 11.
Yes, and man, I was so exhausted by covering the election.
Yeah, it was an exhausting election.
And I wasn't even covering the election. I was just blogging occasionally about what other people covered. And I felt as though reading blogs every day, I had so much information and was paying so much more attention than the average media consumer that I have no idea how someone who is on the bus, as they say, could ever sort of keep a clear perspective about what people needed to know. If I were sent out to cover things for a major newspaper, or especially actually a local newspaper. I used to work in Rancho Cucamonga, California, for example. If I were reporting to the folks back there, it would be very hard for me to sort of figure out what do these people need to know, and to separate that from what do I care about, and to separate it from the career incentive that I have to break news that is of interest to bloggers and to elites, as opposed to breaking news that's of interest to people who, maybe pick up the paper and every few days read one campaign story.
Right. Like what's best for Conor as a political story.
And I think what's best for me as a reporter is definitely different than what's best for my reader. And I don't actually know how to answer what's best for my reader.
And what's best for your editor.
Publication.
Yeah, well, what's best for your editor is yet another layer, right? And
absolutely. Well, but you were involved with a sort of new way to cover a presidential election. Can you talk a little bit about OffTheBus and what you were trying to do with it?
Well, Ariana and I just sent out... in the last.
And this is Ariana Huffington, we should say.
Yes, Ariana Huffington and I just sent out in the last 24 hours a thank you to the 12,000 people who at one point or another volunteered for OffTheBus, and we told them they were up for this innovation award, which is cool. And we told them that some of them would be absorbed into the Huffington Post as contributors, and so the main thing I have at the end of the experiment, which is been run for an election cycle, is just a lot of appreciation of people participating, because you don't necessarily know what kind of response you're going to get.
So basically at the beginning of the cycle, you just put the call out, we're going to have citizen journalists
we started with a different idea. Well, the idea that we had at the beginning was open platform, crowd-powered election coverage by lots of people all over the country who would be, users of the Huffington Post or there somehow. And instead of sending people into the campaign maw, onto the bus, into the trail, our idea was leave them where they are in American life. Like, let them be regular political people interested in the election. And when the campaign comes to them, and when it touches them, or where it touches them, that's where they should narrate from. So we didn't think we had such a brilliant idea about how to report the election. We just had this notion of let's have lots of different starting points and lots of different people involved. And we wanted to experiment with distributed forms of reporting, which was the second part of it. So OffTheBus became really three things. It became a blogging platform for people who wanted to do political writing and commentary on the election, right, that enabled them to get onto the front page of OffTheBus or the politics section or the front page of Huffington Post. So it's an incentive structure, right? And so that was one thing it was. The second thing it was distributed reporting projects where we try to show that there is strength of numbers when you are gathering information and putting together information. And we did certain things there that helped us learn how do you recruit lots of people into reporting, which is still, I think, a really important puzzle. So we advanced the ball a bit on that. And then we were part of this new fact, which is that people can report on the campaign whether they're just part of it as participants, spectators, because they had tools now. People have media tools. And they are at these events. And so the media sphere is spreading to people with their own cameras and their own recording equipment. And we kind of pushed that forward. So I feel good about it as a experiment because it was like, can you run an open platform political coverage team and produce a flow of stories and content that is comparable to what prose working in a very different way can do? That was our experiment. And I think we showed you can.
And was there anything that that sort of non-professionals, just being political people, did different from the prose that was interesting?
Well, one thing we learned is that everybody was into the race, I mean, in one sense, I have some sympathy with horse-faced journalists in the sense that there's no demand, no dispute that there's tremendous demand for good information about the race. The problem comes when the editorial agenda as a whole is shaped by simply covering the race, which gets you into these kinds of circular sort of priorities that don't make a lot of sense. And so what's cool about using our diverse approach is that people have a lot of different starting points. They bring knowledge to the subject. Just to put it in one simple example, the nurse who knows a lot about healthcare, Connor, can write a very good piece about the candidates' healthcare proposals. You know what I mean? Sure. From her life, from her knowledge, from her life, from her expertise. And that we wanted to tap that person, and we also wanted to have people work in teams to play off the news, deepen the news, go more in depth than the news would. Just more of 1,000 points of light idea was all really that you needed for that section editorially.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's shift gears.
Yeah.
And one of the things we wanted to talk about today was sort of right of center journalism, conservative journalism.
Well, I have something I want to ask you about first.
Yes, go ahead.
Which is a lead into that. It's part of that. You mentioned Culture 11, this new magazine that you're part of.
Yes.
And you're a founding editor. Would that be accurate?
I am, yes. I mean, I didn't found the company, but I am its first features editor.
Okay, first features editor. So tell us what you think you're doing with Culture 11. Why do we need it? What is it? What is its niche? What are you doing that's different than, National Review or whatever? What's like the strategy here? What's the vision?
Well, again, I recently went through the process of writing writer's guidelines, which sort of focuses the mind and forces you to describe your publication. And of course, the thing that every editor wants to say is, well, read it and you'll get an idea of what it is. When we started, we were sort of tagged in the Gawker post and the New Republic blog post describing us as we were going to be sort of a conservative Slate. And I love Slate, and so I am not at all unhappy about that description. We're a web magazine like Slate, and we try to publish stories that cover, a similar range of topics. We cover politics, we cover arts, we cover culture, but I think we're different in some important ways too. One thing, as far as the range of topics that we're trying to cover, we are trying to cover religion and faith a little bit better than other web magazines do. We also want to be a magazine that is on the center right, but is as much about culture as it is about politics. There are a lot of political magazines out there, the National Review and the Weekly Standard and the American Conservative, and we hope that Culture 11 is a place that talks about politics. We have a great political editor, James Poulos, but we don't want to make everything about politics. We don't want to make everything about being a liberal or a conservative or an independent. We want to say that there's this big slice of life out there that has nothing to do with politics. And
but is Culture 11 founded on some sense of a missing voice on the right, or a failure of journalism on the right, or a unoccupied stage, or what is the insight there?
I think there is, there is an unoccupied place on the right for, how can I put this? A lot of center-left magazines, a lot of cultural magazines are center-left in their sort of sensibility. So if you read, the New York Times Magazine or Vanity Fair or Esquire, they're all great magazines. They're not political magazines. They're not out to push their agenda, but they're also generally left of center in their sensibility. And in the same way, we would love to do great journalism and be committed to great ideas and the sort of journalistic project of conversation and debate and great reporting, but also have a sort of center-right sensibility and be a little bit more sensitive to those kinds of things. I also think, if I could talk a little bit about the political aspect of what we're doing, there's a lot of infighting, as I'm sure you've seen on the right now. And,
I'm loving it.
You have all of these magazines. You have the National Review, and you can kind of think of their editorial line and the kinds of people that write there. And not that they're all the same, but the same thing with the Weekly Standard. You can think of their sort of foreign policy statement. Right. You can think of the American Conservative and their sort of paleo sympathies and anti-Iraq war. And
so you got your own crowd, is what you're saying.
Well, what I'm saying actually is one of the things that I like about our magazine is that someone from the Weekly Standard could publish an article at Culture 11, and someone from the National Review could, and someone from the American Conservative could. And, we've published liberal writers, and we'll continue to do that too. And I sort of see it, people have used this circular firing squad metaphor. And I like to think of us as kind of a demilitarized zone where lots of different people can come and there can be a conversation among these competing ideas. And no one is going to say, if you don't think this one thing, you're not a conservative. Or if you don't think this one thing.
I like that. Demilitarized zone.
Yes.
So, wait a minute. I want to stick with that. So you're saying that part of the editorial gesture, if you will, is that you're trying to quiet things down, clear a space, demilitarize some sort of cooler space, right? This must be founded on some observation. So what's the observation, Conor?
Well, I mean, again, the observation is that there's an attempt to find heretics on the right now. And it is, for example, during the primaries, during the general election, I wrote a piece basically arguing that the Palin pick was a mistake for the McCain campaign. And I suggested that back early on, before the first debate, that they might be better served by dropping her from the ticket and picking someone else. And the reaction to it had a lot of criticism, like you'll get with any political piece. But the most disturbing criticism, I think, was from Eric Erickson at Red State, who wrote a blog post in which he did two things that I think are really antithetical to what the blogosphere should be. One was to say, I am kicking you out of the conversation because you hold this view. I think he said something like, I'm happy to let someone who's established their conservative bona fides like Kathleen Parker write about this, but not these Culture 11 folk. The second thing that he did was that he refused to link to the piece.
That's really bad form.
And I think that is really bad form, and it's sort of it isn't the ethos that the blogosphere should have, and you should be able to disagree and to think that there is some inherent value in having the argument, and I think that there is. I have a sort of faith that not every time, but many times, having an argument will convince people that you're in the right when you are in the right, so I think, that was one blog post, and I don't want to make it sound like a huge deal, especially when, saying do not go to this site inevitably causes people to just Google it and go there.
Well, there could be a technological fix to that. So we can't have a complex editorial intention and say, I don't actually recommend this guy's thinking at all, but I'm going to take you there because I want you to see it. There really isn't, an easy way to say that. So maybe technology would help us out. But even so, to me, the ethic of the link is pretty clear. But yes, wouldn't it be accurate to say, just one more thing on this Culture 11, that the fracture over Palin is certainly an event giving birth to this magazine? Isn't that correct?
Oh no, not at all. I mean, we were
not at all.
We were established long before the Palin pick.
But
do you mean just as far as giving us traffic?
No, identity profile.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, as a magazine, we don't have any stance on the Palin pick. I mean, I wrote against the Palin pick. We have people on staff who thought the Palin pick was just fine.
Okay, cool.
So I think that I would say, insofar as the Palin pick was an example where we were saying it's okay to disagree about this and disagree forcefully but respectfully.
Right.
And there were some others who would set up the Palin pick as a litmus test.
Yeah, right.
There were people at the National Review who didn't think that the Palin pick was a good idea. There were people at the American Spectator who thought the same.
Well, I like the idea that
they tended to be very quiet.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, because it is a demilitarized zone, meaning people who would be at odds are in the same space, and it's fine. So I like that. I like the cooling down idea. But if it's a demilitarized zone, what you're saying is that Culture 11 is founded on cooling down the culture war, because the whole idea of a demilitarized zone, I think, implies that, which to me is interesting. Anyway, I wish you luck with it. I think it's a cool project. I think it should be good.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, I don't want to quite commit to the entire metaphor of demilitarized zone, since I came up with it in this conversation and haven't thought it completely through. But I think there is definitely a sense that it would be better for the country and for our political discourse if things cooled down insofar as, I don't want to stop people from expressing forceful opinions and having passion about things and arguing what they want. I just want them to buy into the idea that the conversation is sort of essential to the functioning of a democracy, where we have to sort of talk about ideas and where hopefully arguing about ideas will at least get rid of the worst parts of them and point out people's errors. And
but you better put out a good magazine with really good reporting and stuff we don't know, and it has to be good journalistically or forget it. Next question.
Yes.
What's next on our hit parade? I think we have lots of issues to get to.
Yes, well, let's talk about the right and the mainstream media more generally. You've wanted to talk, I think, about reality-based conservatism. Is this something you've had on your mind?
I have this personal kind of interpretation of the last 8 years that I've been building up, and I just continue to expand it and refine it. And I don't think it's I don't think it's right. I just think it's on the right track. But anyway, one interpretation, let's say, of the 2008 election, for me, has been watching what happened since a kind of journalistic event in the 2004 election played out. And that was the appearance in October of 2004 of Ron Suskind's famous article, Without a Doubt, about George Bush and his faith-based way of making decisions. Mm-hmm. And I've studied that article. I've heard Susskind talk about it himself when he came to NYU and gave a talk, which was very interesting. I've kind of tracked its influence since then. And it's like a writer's crusade, It's like an idea I have. I don't want to let it go. And so I just keep writing about it. Mm-hmm. And what I thought happened in that article in October 24 was that people inside the Bush White House or administration, Republicans, were signaling out to people who were supporters but not inside the loop that something was going on in the way the Bush White House was making decisions, that all appearances suddenly became fraudulent, and everything started to be for show, and everybody at the same time realized that the real decisions were being made elsewhere, and all the means of accountability were being voided, and a kind of projection of certainty had come over the government, and they were saying that this is happening. And they weren't ready to put their names to it yet, because they weren't sure how many other people knew anything about this or cared about it. But they were his sources, well, at least half his sources, were actually Republicans. This is what people always forget about that article. The people talking to Susskind were Republicans. They were concerned. They were trying to send a message. Something had gone weird in the way the Bush administration was making decisions. But what people remember today is this inflammatory quote from an unnamed Bush advisor who said, you people in the reality-based community don't understand that we make reality, right? And you're going to be studying what we do, right? And this phrase, the reality-based community, was so apt in some ways and so explosive that it kind of hypnotized everybody. And we forgot what was actually being said. We put the two things together. The reality-based community is everybody who had served as a reality check on the White House, including journalists, but many other people too. Because we had evolved a way of making decisions in the executive branch through things like the National Security Council and lots of other things, where we do subject political projects to a reality test. What the people inside talking to Susskind were saying is that whole thing had been subverted. It was a story. It was a very important story, and they were trying to get it out. Okay, so fast forward. It turns out that kind of governance, that kind of administration, can generate a lot of political power, can win elections. It's like, in a sense, a winning strategy, or it was for 8 years. And to me, the big story in the 2008 election was, would the Republican machine and Republican candidate do this again, sort of pick up from where Bush left off? Or would it return to a more reality-based but Republican and conservative campaign? And this was a question that wouldn't be answered once, but across a range of sort of indicators. And that's how I viewed the entire campaign. And what a story it was. Because the McCain campaign started out as the one that could, in fact, do that. Run as a reality-based Republican. That's sort of what the journalists thought he was. And it turned out it went a completely different way, and the Palin nomination sealed it for everybody in the reality-based community. That's what Colin Powell's endorsement of Obama on Meet the Press was ultimately about. The answer to Suskind's article in 2004 was Powell on Meet the Press endorsing Obama.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that, throughout the Bush's 2 terms in office, he sort of had every once in a while, high-level staffer drops off, writes a book, sort of excoriates the White House, and says, wow, things inside there, things weren't being done well. It's the line that David Frum is sort of arguing now. that not anyone can be a successful executive. It takes more than good instincts. It takes more than agreeing with people on the broad outlines of political philosophy.
Right.
It takes talent, and it takes administrative ability, and it especially takes a willingness to sort of know your weaknesses and listen to dissenting voices, and not have loyalty be the test of
totally
whether staffers are valued. I think that you're right that is why the Palin nomination grated on a lot of conservatives and a lot of people across the political spectrum, because they thought, well, here we are again, and we're making sort of cultural cues and loyalty the primary thing, not competence. And we've seen the effects that has had over the last 8 years. Competence is important. And so I think you're right as far as that goes, and that the Palin pick had sort of shades of the worst mistakes of the Bush administration.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that I would say that the McCain campaign tried to be unreality based in exactly the same way. I say that.
No, not in the same way. No. But they. Okay, go ahead. Complete your.
Well, so I say this as someone who was sort of horrified by much of the McCain campaign. Sort of because of its lack of substance. I kept feeling like, there are things that I believe in that John McCain believes in, and he's not articulating any of them. He is instead sort of focusing on slogans like, drill baby drill, that, whatever you think of drilling in Alaska, it's a small part of what faces the country. And he's focusing on sort of... do you know Barack Obama? What the William Ayers connection and all this sort of thing. It was really for two men with political philosophies as different as Obama and McCain. It was an election that was frighteningly substanceless, I think.
Yeah, but we agree on that, and we're not saying anything new. I mean, everybody sort of sees the campaign was empty of ideas. I mean, people on the right are saying that too.
Yeah, and what I would say that the most problematic part of the McCain campaign was, or at least a very problematic part, was the particular way in which they tried to use cultural cues to win voters.
Yes.
It seems pernicious to me in the sense that whether you eat arugula or go to NASCAR races or whatever other cultural cue that you want to pick says nothing about your beliefs about politics, says nothing about what's important to you as a voter. This should not be how we separate ourselves into tribes. And it also puzzles me because insofar as the Republican Party is going to double down on sort of working-class whites in small towns and denigrate anyone who lives in a city or lives in fake Virginia, as someone put it.
It's amazing.
They're allaying themselves with like a shrinking demographic. Just strategically, it seems insane and bad.
But I think the reason that came about, Connor, is that culture war is the default strategy. And so they went that way. Not so much that McCain willed it or that, he had to appeal to the base. I mean, that's true, but it's not adequate. I really think that Smith, without directing it that way, just ends up with a culture war strategy because they're going to what they know. And it's not. I never thought that the McCain campaign had any kind of strategy, had any vision. It wasn't held together by a coherent idea or people who were coherent. It was reactive. It was pieced together, and very much a product of McCain's own lack of discipline. And because, and this is the fascinating part, which we want to get to next. Because there was a psychodrama, I don't think that is a hyperbolic term, going on between McCain campaign, and the national press throughout the entire election.
Yeah, so let's talk about
there's another psychodrama going on, with the infatuation with Obama. I'm happy to talk about that too. But McCain, as you know, had a unique, putting it mildly, relationship. And I think this is the key to understanding the disaster that enterprise became. Let me just give you a summary of my view of it. McCain wasn't kidding when he said, my base. There's a lot of reality to that, in the sense that if you are somebody who's hated by people in one party and another, where do you find political authority? Political journalism is like, he understood that you could do that if you can take the give and take, right? So in January, he told Howard Kurtz, who asked him directly, are you going to employ the straight talk, style for if you win the nomination? He said, I have to, or I lose credibility. What did he mean? Well, not with the American people. The American people have never decided an election based on someone's press policy, right? He meant,
sure.
Okay. So, and the biggest problem they have is that in McCain's mind, he kept that promise, but his actual campaign departed drastically from it. He couldn't carry it through, and he doesn't know that. And the campaign pretended not to know that. And so they chose to rage at these people, and it came to a head several times. So anyway, the McCain campaign thinks it was killed by the press. The press thinks it was stiffed by the McCain campaign. The press's narrative is he changed. McCain's narrative is changed what? And it is like two people who can't even see where the other is anymore. And this psychodrama is responsible for a lot of what happened in the campaign.
There is a fascinating relationship between McCain and the press, especially if you go back as far as 2000,
right?
When he was very conscious of being the press's guy.
Oh, the arc is 2000 to 08. That's the only way to understand 08 for the press, and McCain is that arc.
And so you get to 08 and what turns out to be a disastrous way of handling the press. And it gets to this idea on the right that some say, the McCain, some would argue that the McCain campaign's mistake was that they didn't bypass the press enough. You hear arguments, they should have just sent Sarah Palin to talk to Rush Limbaugh and other sympathetic radio hosts and go talk to local newspapers. McCain should have talked to local editorial boards all around the country and local TV stations and just sort of bypass the national press.
Right.
I think that this is mistaken and that this is a dangerous thing for conservatives to pursue. I don't quite have an answer for the McCain campaign, however, because I do think that there are some legitimate critiques that the right has of the press. I don't think that it's a simplistic matter of a conspiratorial liberal media or anything. But I do think that there is sometimes coverage that is biased against conservatives. And I think this is actually, covering horse race politics, the press kind of has a frame for that and knows how to do it. And I think oftentimes tries to be objective. I think that it's talking about particular issues that conservatives are often at a little bit more of a disadvantage. A line that I keep arguing in a few pieces that I've written, and that I'm still sort of thinking through, is that conservatives and libertarians are often concerned with the unintended consequences of policy. And so if you think to pick a simplistic example, think of rent control.
We're familiar with unintended consequences, and they wouldn't be part of what liberals would say the program is about, but they happen anyway. And conservatives are alert to those,
Sure, and I would say, though, that the media, it's hard for the media to report on unintended consequences because they're not a thing that's happening. It's not a matter of ideology as much as, how do you report on the fact that 2 years from now, a new building might not be built if you impose rent control now. So I would argue that insofar as conservatives and libertarians are kind of concerned with unintended consequences, their ideas get short shrift sometimes. And another example,
Walter Lippmann said, sorry to interrupt you, Connor, but this is a university we're at here, that this was the difference between news and truth. A very important distinction between news and truth.
Right.
Things that are true don't always break as news. They don't always take the form of news. And so they elude news. And people in politics are very often concerned with truth, and they ask, why doesn't the news equal the truth? You know? Yeah. And Lippman was saying, you just blew it there because these are not the same thing.
So if I could make one more quick point before I circle back to McCain.
Yeah, McCain and the press.
Another topic that I have covered a great deal is immigration. I wrote a blog and a twice-weekly column on it in a paper in California, and read every story in the national press and local newspapers that I could about immigration over the
You must have been massively disappointed in McCain, man.
Well, I have a complicated position on immigration that I won't get into now, but suffice it to say that one thing that was written more than any other kind of story, there's a breaking news story, immigration raid nets this many people. But as far as enterprise stories, the one that was most often written was the sort of sympathetic immigrant narrative. And it's one that I happen to be very sympathetic to. Growing up in California, I have known tons of immigrants, and their stories are often really inspiring and just sort of great narrative stories. And they're really sympathetic people who, have families and work hard and all of the rest. And I would say to conservatives who are upset about the sympathetic immigrant narratives that you cannot cover the truth of immigration in our country without them. But I would go on to say that another part of reality that people covering something like immigration have to render is that there are costs. If you have a neighborhood where suddenly the school has a big demographic shift in language and it's really hard to hire teachers and classrooms are divided between people speaking 3 different languages, that has costs, and the people, the parents there are attuned to those costs. And when they don't read about that in their newspaper, it reduces the credibility of that paper. And all of this is just to say that there are a few areas where I would cite where I think conservatives and libertarians feel with good reason that they've been that their ideas haven't been given their due. And I don't think that the answer to this is to bypass the press or to discredit it. I think it's to engage the press and try to make it better. But this is a big question facing the right, and
sure is huge.
And McCain picked bypass and discredit.
Discredit, way more than discredit. Let's attack. Let's make this part of our politics. Let's whip up anti-media sentiment. Let's integrate it into our culture war approach, and let's completely bullshit our professional peers, the people on the other side of the transaction, because that's what a lot of these insiders are, and lie through our teeth about the New York Times in order to their peers and try and claim it's some sort of propaganda organization because it's giving us shitty coverage. I mean, when Steve Smith did that, to me, he crossed into some, some temple of horrors that he decided was necessary to show how tough he is and how mad he is. And I don't know. There was something extreme to me about it. There was something extreme about the way McCain handled Jay Carney and his colleague in Time magazine in August when they came in and asked him a question about honor, for example, and why the State Talk Express wasn't operating anymore. Meaning, you couldn't come up to McCain and sit down on the couch and interview him like you could in 2000. So why the change? McCain said, "What change?" And this denial of the person sitting there, such that Jay McCartney says to him, "Do I know you?" Right? Which is a severe detachment from reality. Those extreme measures are much more than a couple of instances of unfair coverage. That's running on the fuel of a culture war strategy that incorporates the press.
Sure, and I mean, there's so many moments in this campaign.
Extreme.
There's so many moments in this campaign that I was paying close attention and actually missed the one you were just talking about. But the most blinkered media moment for me was the Palin interviews with Gibson and Couric. And after the fact, I heard for weeks that, it was a gotcha interview that Katie Couric gave. It was, unfair. Of course Palin didn't do well. She went in trying to submarine her. And, I would respond a few times on our staff blog, The Confabulum, and I would say, if you're arguing that was a gotcha interview, just what question was it that Katie Couric asked that was inappropriate to ask a vice presidential candidate? And, of course, there was no answer.
No, of course.
When you get to that level of treating that interview as not only a hard interview, but a gotcha interview in an unfair sense, you've gone far enough that even people who are sympathetic to the narrative that the press is in some sense against you start to say, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
This
what
is
is that?
Unhinged.
Exactly.
Like,
exactly. Unhinged.
You can't fool me by telling me that Katie Couric is responsible for Sarah Palin not being able to perform well.
It's worse than that. Go back a few weeks. The tip-off was Tucker Bounds with Campbell Brown on CNN. As soon as you pick Palin and you introduce her to the American people, if you are a wise Republican operative and you're preparing this person and yourself, your campaign for defending the pick, one of the first questions you wargame, one of the first questions you would think about is, okay, foreign policy, Sarah Palin, what are we going to say? What is our strategy, right? And Tucker Bounds, a spokesman for the McCain campaign, who is in this instance the defender and explainer of Sarah Palin, who at that time, of course, couldn't be asked any questions, goes on and says, when asked, what is Sarah Palin's foreign policy experience? A totally anticipatable question, right? This would be one of the first things you and I would discuss when we sit down. Okay, how are we going to roll this person out? What do we say, right? On the first question, he goes with something that nobody in the country and nobody in the political class can believe, which is huge foreign policy experience. She, with Russia and Alaska and, a line of questioning that he himself cannot sustain. And Tucker Bounds turns this interview into a confrontation with Campbell Brown that he loses over a question that they have to be able to answer it because it's going to come up like 300 times. So if the very first test, you can't even manage an interview about this candidate, there's something wrong right there. And that's what exploded in the Katie Couric interview.
Yeah, I think, I'm actually curious what you think about, thankfully we won't run a McCain-Palin ticket ever again.
I don't know. It depends on what lesson is learned. What were those Republican governors thinking? Seriously. When 7 or 8 of them crowd around and they get up on a stage with Sarah Palin and the governors are having a press conference and then they're miffed that all the questions go to her?
Sure. I would say presidential candidates tend to be sort of singular people. And I don't know if we'll ever see a John McCain again.
True.
For all the good and the bad.
Very true.
And beyond that, I don't have any particular expertise in, advising Bobby Jindal or whoever it's going to be in 4 years or in 8 years or whatever.
Me neither. I don't give candidates advice.
But what I would say to anyone who will listen on the right, what I have been saying is that one thing that the right should do is at every level start engaging journalism. And I would say the same thing for academia, actually.
Yeah, but how?
But knowing a bit more about journalism, I would say the sort of argument I've laid out is that the right needs more journalists as opposed to advocates.
Yeah, that'd be good.
And it needs more,
reporters.
To use a simplistic example, even among commentators, someone like David Brooks is infinitely more valuable to people who care about conservative ideas than someone like Bill Kristol. Not because of anything either one of them thinks, but because one of them is engaged in intellectually honest conversation and trying to persuade people and thinking that arguments are valuable. And the other, at least in his New York Times columns, just isn't.
Kristol was a disappointing appointment, in my opinion, as a reader of the New York Times.
And I would say that, if you could tell me right now that I could have another William F. Buckley or I could have a bunch of Tom Wolfes running around doing reporting, I would take the Tom Wolfes because I want
let's turn those pundits into reporters. I like it. Yeah. Let's get more conservatives out in the street. Shoe leathers. Why aren't there more conservatives in newsrooms, Connor? What's the big deal? All you have to do is suffer low pay, shitty conditions in 2-bit towns for like 10 years, and you can rise into the newsroom. You can. It's competitive. It's very competitive. But you can become an editor. You can become a reporter. You can get to the Washington Bureau. So what's the deal here? Are they not up to it? Are they like they just making too much money on Wall Street? They don't have this. What is it?
I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't know
you don't
people
know,
go
and I
into
don't know.
Newspapers.
That's a big missing cohort there.
Yeah, I think so. I think when I don't know. I'm dissatisfied with newspapers at the moment. I mean, there are some great writers for the
I totally understand
Post,
that.
The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal.
Right. I'm not saying that I would necessarily counsel a person to go that way. I'm saying
sure, I mean,
if you look back 15, 20 years, what's the deal?
Yeah, I don't know what the deal is. And I guess I would say, though, that it's one thing to be a conservative journalist. And it's another thing to be a journalist who happens to be conservative.
Yeah.
And the right desperately needs more of the latter.
No, I'd say both actually myself, but I'm into both. I think conservative journalist is fine, and journalists have to be conservative.
I do too.
Fine, yeah.
I just think there are plenty of them.
Oh yeah, okay.
There are plenty of conservative journalists. There aren't very many journalists who happen to be conservative.
Well, yeah, but you just got to reproduce yourself. There needs to be more. You need to show it, and let's break stories at Culture 11. That'll show people, hey,
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, we're trying to do a few things. We're trying to break stories. We are trying to have good analysis. We're trying to air arguments and sort of get people that disagree to actually talk to one another.
But having nice civic intentions is not good enough. That is not an editorial idea. It never works.
And what would you recommend to a young magazine on the center right that is trying to do great journalism?
I would say I would hire writer-reporters to establish reported blogs that have a core audience and then a broader pale of interested readers. Mm-hmm. And I would develop, along with a regular user and loyal subscriber base for that reported blog and columnist and personality, I would start to develop a network of tipsters, recommenders, filterers, kibitzers, informants that I would actually build into a community and a database around that one reporter. Aiming for like 1,000 to 1 ratio of magazine person to network, and so if you imagine like the blog starting as a blog and then evolving into more of like the corner with thousands of people attached to it and reporting emerging from that network like OffTheBus, that's what I would do. But I would do that in any magazine. I would do the same thing. So I would just take yours. Yeah. I would take your little franchise there and build on that.
It's an interesting moment at magazines.
Yeah,
the corner has gotten a lot of attention this election cycle.
They were one of the losers, I have to say, but in my opinion. But yes, they have.
Especially with Chris Buckley and David Frum leaving, and there have been the reactions to it on the corner. And one thing it's made me think about is how much is a magazine's blog like the magazine itself? Because
they're different. They're different. Yeah.
I think they're very different, and I like a lot of writers at the National Review. I think that Yuval Levin often does great stuff. I think that Jim Manzi is one of my favorite writers. He also writes at the American Scene. I think that Ramesh sometimes does really good stuff. I think that whatever you think their quality is, the corner is worse than they are. Mm-hmm. And I don't quite know what that is. It's partly a matter of focus, and it's really hard to blog and blog with lots of people and about a bunch of stuff every day and have it come out good. But the New York Times just did a story.
I read it. It blamed the internet. The internet made National Review course at its own blog. That's what it said to me.
And what was frustrating to me about that piece was that Rich Lowry, the print editor, and Catherine Jean Lopez, the online editor at the National Review, are very different people. This is something one of my colleagues has mentioned too, that they're very different people and they have different editorial styles, and surely that's part of it. Surely it's not just medium. I feel like too often, the internet and the blogosphere comes in for blame for the coarsening of political discourse. But one thing I wanted to ask you about, sort of spinning off this, is you've been around the blogosphere a long time, and you're familiar with the right of center blogs and the left of center blogs. And there's sort of a discussion going on now on the right with the Next Right, that Patrick Ruffini project.
Yes.
John Henke writes that they've got a lot of smart people, sort of what does the right need, what kind of infrastructure does it need to build.
Right.
And you're really familiar with HuffPo and with TPM. What, in your view, is sort of the difference in infrastructure between the sort of netroots and the right roots, for lack of a better name?
I think that's a really intricate question. I don't think it yields to simple-minded narratives very well. I do think there's been more momentum on the left, and that essentially what happened was the right and the press both bought the narrative of the Dean campaign as this total bust, except for fundraising. And people on the left didn't see it that way at all. And what they did is they continued with the central insight that Trippy and company had, which was that the falling cost for like-minded people to locate each other, get together, share information, and produce stuff was really important for politics, and especially for a presidential campaign. When you think about what a presidential campaign is, right? Involving people, raising money, getting the word out, all these things lend themselves to networks, and the cost of an effective network was plunging. And so you had to keep going with that experiment. You had to keep going with that idea and develop it, because it was an insight, even though the Dean campaign was a losing campaign, right? And ended in a kind of conflagration. And so to the right, Dean was such a joke. I was a candidate, and like they never even got over their original misapprehension of him as a socialist lefty. He was actually a very centrist guy, but they didn't even know that. And the press was totally uninterested in this web sort of dimension, the social media part of it. If anything, they said, okay, internet good for fundraising. That's what we know. We can bank that, right? And so they all ignored it. And what happened on the left was people said, oh, no, they were on the right track. Let's just keep going, keep building. And the infrastructure is bigger than, it's not an email list. It's not just that. It's a whole culture of blogging, of content management tools, of things like my nephew Zach Rosen was doing with Civic Space Labs, which is equipping people to be more organized online, and then showing them why it's important, as well as networks of organizations that are not party-related and blogging leading to other blogging. And so it's just more vibrant sphere. It's just more activity, more people.
And how do you go from being Josh Marshall blogger to the whole TPM enterprise now?
How did he do it, you mean?
Right. I mean...
Well, the Marshall model is of a distributed user base of loyal readers who are high information people who know a lot of stuff but also want to know a lot of stuff. They're not insiders because they're actually people are outsiders but very interested all over the country, all over the world. And the day starts when these people, because they know how to do this, they send stuff in. They're sending in comment boards. They send it as emails. They send it to Josh's muckrakers. They send to Josh. And Marshall tells his people, he's trained them. The first thing they do is they go through their inboxes, what's come in. And then they filter a lot of that stuff. Some of it they use in their reporting. Some of it they check out. And they have going at all times 3 or 4 sort of big stories that Marshall himself and his guys or gals have kind of said this is going to be important, and they pour a lot of energy to it, and they're able to combine what the web does well around these 3 or 4 obsessions and the inflow from readers. And so the different parts of the empire, which is Josh's blog himself where the front page happens, news aggregation that brings you the news that are on the major stories that they know their audience is interested in from all over the place. Same thing that drives Huffington Post. Plus a muckraker site where original reporting and digging goes on, plus 2 p.m. Cafe, where readers and others luminaries have their own blogs, so that's the community site. And it all works together to create something that's right now, it's bigger online than the Los Angeles Times, and it keeps growing because he's totally in tune, not just with an audience, but with the web, the two-way web, and the day starts with the inflow from this distributed user base. And he's beginning to figure out a journalism that follows from that. And it's very exciting.
Yeah, it is. And it seems much more information-based than...
Oh, it's very information-based. Totally.
Than Pajamas say, even though Pajamas attempts to do original reporting. It still seems a little bit centered around Instapundit. And,
yeah. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out this 1,000 to 1 notion. Which I'm going to write.
How you build that?
Yeah, how you build a network around a reporter, essentially, or a network structure around a reporting staff. Right. And one thing I learned from OffTheBus was, at a certain point we only ran OffTheBus for 16 months, but if we had continued into a second year, what I would do would pick from my list of 12,000 people who were on our list a group to start working with a reporter full-time. And that reporter's job would be, at the end of a certain period of time, to have a working network of a certain size. It wouldn't be like one of the million things he's doing. Like, this is the main thing you're doing. You're learning how to... And I know this is going to happen. It's very frustrating because I know it's going to work. And it's just like a question of when we figure out how to do it and get the right people, and it happens. But we're getting there. And Marshall is definitely proving the power of inflow from users as an editorial system. Right there, you've got something to build on.
So we have one more topic to hit, and that is the politics of victimhood. And, we emailed back and forth before this, and you were saying that you think that the politics of victimhood is sort of shifted from the left to the right.
Did you read that Mark Lilla piece in the Wall Street Journal?
I believe so. Remind me.
Mark Lilla wrote about how intellectual conservatism is dead. It was very exciting at one time when he was in graduate school, and Palin, for him, as for me, symbolized like a kind of intellectual death. If you can accept that, you can accept anything. That was his view. That's my view. Anyway, I agree with him that when I was in graduate school, I read the same journals of public interest and national interest. I was interested in the rise of neoconservative thought. It wasn't my thing. I was never one of them at all. But I was very interested in their rise, and I read a lot about him. People like Moynihan always intrigued me. And Crystal's father. And I wouldn't say I studied them, but I certainly read a lot about them. And one of the best points the conservatives had in the 80s and 90s was that the left had fallen into a victim kind of politics and identity politics that later lots of people on the left also got impatient with. And these were really good arguments. And it struck me that these were really sharp observations about how culture did matter, and also shaped politics. And people like Shelby Steele, I don't know if you ever read him, I thought his arguments were very interesting when he started. I think he then evolved in a direction I couldn't go with him on. But there's no doubt that today one of the coolest, biggest, most fascinating cultural politics stories is how the politics of victimhood traveled from the left, where they were established, to the right, because that's what happened this election. Completely.
Right. And so this is something that I call the politics of Schadenfreude. Basically, the idea that political elites are trying to get the base to vote for them, not because they agree with them so much as because they hate the other team.
Well, yeah. Especially in a policy vacuum, an intellectual vacuum, that's like a ready-made thing, right?
And I think that you saw with the Palin nomination, you saw, a sort of hidden glee from the right when there would be the sort of over-the-top attacks from the left, because that was good for them. The stronger a mainstream media figure attacked Sarah Palin, then the more the base would rally around her.
But isn't that a culture war strategy? That's what a culture war strategy is,
it
right?
Absolutely is. And I would say that it's just really unhealthy for the person doing it.
It totally wrecks you. It wrecks the conservative. Culture war is killing the Republican Party. It's killing the right. Absolutely.
But I would actually disagree with the idea that conservative thought is dead. I think
that was Lilla. That wasn't me. That's what he said. But yeah,
okay. Sure, yeah. But to sort of push back against Lilla, maybe if you take the writers that he's talking about or the venues that he's talking about as the only conservative thought, that would be right. But David Brooks wrote a column a while back about young heterodox thinkers on the right.
Yeah, I read it.
One of the people he mentioned was James Poulos, who's our political editor, and
cool,
great to work with and unpredictable and sort of an in-house political philosopher all his own. At The Atlantic, where I interned previous to starting at Culture 11, I worked with Reihan Salam and Ross Douthat, who wrote their book about their take on the conservative path, and both of them are just fascinating people to get to know, and so well-spoken and so intellectually honest. And also, I don't know if I bet a lot of Blogging Heads viewers are familiar with The American Scene, which is sort of a Reihan Salam curated.
Yeah, I've seen it. I don't follow it regularly, but I know it. Yep.
But yeah, Jim Manzi,
and I follow some of these people
writes there, and Alan Jacobs, who is a professor at Wheaton College, I believe, writes there. And all of these people have really different takes on the direction that conservatism should go, the direction of the conservative movement, whether there even should be a conservative movement. But there's sort of a like-minded spirit of both intellectual honesty and the idea that conversation is important and that it should be.
Well, the interesting question from my point of view, as your former professor, colleague, teammate, would be. What is the journalism that corresponds to that current that you're talking about? What's the reporting necessary to? I think that's a really interesting question, journalistically.
It really is.
And I'd love to see more work on that. I'd also love to see what a more open source and distributed reporting approaches would be like on the right. It'd be really cool. To see what they sort of came up with, if a very vigorous fact-checking and reality-based, tests were part of it, which is how you do it.
Yeah. My read on things is that there is a lot of sort of ferment and arguments right now about what the right needs to do and what infrastructure it needs to build. And
I'm loving it. I'm loving it.
I don't know that it will actually, I don't know if the people with the money to fund things will fund good things or bad things, but they will fund something, and that will at least be interesting to see what comes out of it and what the model will be on the right. I think one of the things that the netroots sort of realized was that for a long time they envied the sort of conservative infrastructure that had been built up of think tanks and whatnot. But eventually they figured out that, well, actually what the left needs to do isn't just mimic exactly what the right has done. It's actually something different, and it plays to the strengths of the left. I don't know what it is exactly that's going to play to the strengths of the right, whether building a movement, building a journalistic project. But I will be interested to see, and I'm sure you'll be writing about it on PressThink, so I will be interested to see what you say about it as it unfolds.
Will a reality-based Republican Party and right wing emerge? Or,
yes, I don't know.
Or will this attempt to create a politics from the culture war and from the very divorce with empiricism we saw under Bush, will that continue? To me, that is where the sole question. That's why you see David Frum, quote unquote, leaving. That's why you see these. That's why you saw Scowcroft object in the first place. It's the same fracture. Ask Lawrence Wilkerson about it. Ask Frum. They're all talking about the same thing, and it's, will we be a reality-based party or not? It's not a joke. It's not a magazine article.
Yeah, it's. I don't know what the fate of the Republican Party will be, but I think that the right as an intellectual space, there will be
I wish it
reality-based
well.
people.
I wish it well, and I'm actually enjoying the rethinking, and I think it's really important.
Great. Well, it has been a pleasure talking, and we should do it again sometime.
Thanks. This is my first blog ahead. It's pretty fun. Thanks, Conor.
Okay. Bye-bye, Jay.
Bye.